What if the biggest mistake everyone is making about Fast 11 is assuming Hobbs has to fully return or fully disappear? The truth? It might be something far more strategic and way more dangerous for the saga. Because, if you really look at how Universal has been positioning Dwayne Johnson lately, it starts to feel less like a comeback and more like a controlled experiment. A world where Hobbs becomes a lever rather than a lead. This is where the theory gets interesting. Fast 11 is under pressure to feel final without actually closing the door, and Hobbs is the perfect variable to test that balance. Since his relationship with Dom was never fully healed, it was simply paused, and Fast X already proved that Universal is willing to break long-standing rules just to regain momentum. So the question isn't will Hobbs return, but how, and in what form? There are three very different paths, and all of them change the future of the franchise in completely different ways. The first option is the obvious one: Hobbs shows up in Fast 11 for a limited but pivotal role. Not as a full team member, but as an outside force, someone who crosses Dom's path because the situation becomes too big to ignore. This would allow Dwayne Johnson to appear without committing to the full ensemble dynamic again, while still giving fans the emotional hit they want. But here's the twist: insiders keep hinting that Hobbs returning too early could overshadow Dom's arc. This is why the second option starts to feel more realistic: a standalone Hobbs project, released between Fast X and Fast 11. Essentially acting as a bridge rather than a sequel, this short film or limited spin-off would reframe Hobbs not as a rival or ally, but as a man dealing with the consequences of walking away. If that happens, it suddenly explains why Fast 11 could still feel complete without him, because his story would already be told elsewhere. Then there's the third option, which is the quietest but possibly the smartest: Hobbs never truly returns to the main saga at all. Instead, he exists as a parallel pillar through Hobbs and Shaw, where Dwayne Johnson can operate without creative friction. This theory gains weight when you realize how carefully his recent appearances have been framed: short scenes, controlled dialogue, and minimal interaction with Dom. It feels more like a teaser than a reunion. This suggests strategy, not reconciliation. If Fast 11 is really about Dom confronting the cost of staying in the fast life, then Hobbs becomes the perfect counterexample: the man who chose power, independence, and distance, and never looked back. Placing them together for too long would blur that contrast, which is why a limited appearance or even an absence might actually serve the story better. This is where American audiences start to feel the tension. They're being asked not just to wait for a cameo, but to question what kind of return even makes sense anymore. If Universal drops a Hobbs-focused midquel, it allows them to answer that question without locking anything in. That flexibility is everything right now. Fast and Furious isn't just closing a chapter, it's deciding which characters are strong enough to carry the brand forward. Dwayne Johnson knows this. His involvement feels calculated, almost surgical. Whether Hobbs returns in Fast 11, stands alone in a spin-off, or hovers in between, the message is the same: the saga is no longer about everyone being together, it's about choosing where you belong. That uncertainty might be the real reason they're keeping everything so quiet. Because once Hobbs' role is confirmed, the illusion of endless possibilities collapses, and Fast 11 becomes a very different movie depending on that single decision. And that silence around Hobbs? It only feeds the theory even more. Because when a studio truly wants to shut down speculation, they leak clarity. When they want debate to grow, they let the vacuum do the work. Universal has been doing exactly that, letting fans argue whether Dwayne Johnson's reconciliation with Vin Diesel was genuine or purely professional. From a business standpoint, Hobbs is no longer just a character. He's leverage. If you trace the timeline, it becomes clear that his return was timed not for Fast 11, but for stability, after Fast X fractured the saga into multiple paths. This opens the door to a fourth possibility that almost nobody is talking about. Hobbs appears in Fast 11. Not physically, but thematically. Through consequences, through decisions made earlier, and through threats that spill over, without him ever standing next to Dom again. That kind of presence is actually more powerful. It turns Hobbs into a shadow over the story, rather than just a participant. This fits perfectly with where Dwayne Johnson's brand is right now: selective, dominant, and never fully tied down. If Universal is smart, they won't rush that reunion. The moment Hobbs and Dom share too much screen time, the tension dissolves. What they need right now is unresolved energy, not closure. This is why the idea of a mid-quiller short film becomes so dangerous in a good way. It allows Hobbs to exist in a controlled space where his arc can evolve without hijacking Fast 11. If audiences respond strongly, Universal gains proof that the Fast universe can survive in parallel lanes. That is the real long-term goal here, not endings, but scalability. Most fans miss this because they're looking for emotional payoffs, while the studio is looking for structural freedom. Hobbs is the key to that freedom. He represents a version of the saga that doesn't rely on family rhetoric or ensemble chaos, but on singular force and moral absolutism. Placing that next to Dom's increasingly introspective arc would either elevate the story, or completely derail it. That is why they're hesitating. That is why no option has been confirmed yet. Each choice creates a different future, and once they choose, they can't undo it. The smartest move for Universal might be to keep Hobbs hovering just outside the frame, long enough for audiences to accept a world where not everyone needs to come back for the story to move forward. Once that idea settles, Fast 11 stops being about reunions and starts being about legacy. At that point, Hobbs doesn't need to return at all, because his impact would already be felt. And that might be the boldest twist of all. And once you start viewing Hobbs that way, the entire marketing silence suddenly makes sense. Because Universal isn't teasing a comeback, they're testing audience tolerance for absence. That's a risky move in a franchise built on returns and reunions, but it might be the only way forward without collapsing under its own weight. If Fast 11 truly wants to feel meaningful, it can't just stack familiar faces. It has to make choices. Choosing not to fully bring Hobbs back would signal a shift from fan service to narrative intent. This is where Dwayne Johnson's real name starts to matter. Dwayne isn't just an actor stepping back into a role, he's a brand. Negotiating power, timing, and control. Every appearance he makes is calculated for maximum impact, with minimal commitment. This explains why a full-time return to Fast 11 feels unlikely, while a strategically placed appearance elsewhere feels inevitable. That's why the short film theory refuses to die. It solves every problem at once. It gives fans something tangible, it gives Universal flexibility, and it gives Dwayne Johnson ownership over the tone and scale of Hobbs without forcing him into the ensemble politics again. Imagine how that plays out. A surprise midquel, released quietly online or attached to another Universal project, where Hobbs faces a threat that never intersects with Dom directly, but alters the balance of power in the Fast universe. By the time Fast 11 arrives, the audience already understands why Hobbs isn't there. His war is happening somewhere else. That absence becomes intentional, rather than disappointing. This also protects Hobbs and Shaw as a separate lane. If Hobbs fully reintegrates into the main saga, that spin-off loses its identity. If he remains parallel, it becomes a long-term pillar instead of a side experiment. This is the future Universal actually wants, a universe where Dom anchors the emotional core, while characters like Hobbs operate as autonomous forces that can be activated when needed. This reframes the question entirely. Now the debate isn't will Hobbs return, but when and for what purpose? The answer determines whether Fast and Furious remains a single saga, or evolves into a network of intersecting stories. That's why Fast 11 feels less like a conclusion and more like a pressure test. Because whichever path Hobbs takes after this point becomes permanent. Universal knows it. Dwayne Johnson knows it. And that mutual awareness is why everything feels so carefully staged. Once Hobbs is placed definitively inside or outside the main story, the illusion of flexibility disappears, and with it, the ability to surprise audiences again. The smartest move might be to never fully answer the question at all. To let Hobbs exist in a state of narrative uncertainty, where his return is always possible, but never guaranteed. Because in a franchise built on speed, the one thing that still creates tension is hesitation. As long as Hobbs remains unresolved, Fast and Furious still has room to maneuver. And that uncertainty may be exactly what keeps the saga alive longer than any reunion ever could.